the national target that determine the contribution not nearly enough to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Many poor countries with low annual emissions have pledged higher target than the rich countries. This is the mockery of the principle of common but differentiated dose responsibility and a human right is a cause of concern. The national target of by a mile in the Paris Agreement, under the Paris Agreement adopted in 2015 as an international treaty to limit and cut the greenhouse gases, the countries agreed to provide the voluntary target called national determined contributions for the how they will limit or reduce the emissions. The route to the agreement also stated that it would work to achieve the goal of keeping the global temperature rise this century to well below 2 degrees centigrade, above the pre-industrial era and the level, and to pursue those efforts to limit the rise up to 1.5 degrees centigrade. As per the agreement, the nations are expected to submit the progressive and more ambitious every 5 years, and accordingly the countries had to submit their second by 2020. But the 192 countries or parties of this Paris Agreement, a majority did not meet the deadline. As of 15th of October 2021, a total of 113 countries. The current scenario is estimated that since 2000, the last 20 years, almost 2 decades, more than 2 decades, China has been the foremost polluter of carbon dioxide. Its percentage of share global carbon dioxide emission in 2019, China has a 28%, more than 1/4. And all the 7 historical pollutants, US, UK, Canada, Russia, Australia, Japan, and all the 27 European Union countries have a contribution of merely 34%. India is 7%, and the rest of the world is 31%. The route to the national policy of this report that suggested that the countries invited to submit the intended nationally that determine the contributors. The Paris Agreement is adopted. 191 countries ratified the agreement. The key milestone for framing the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, the 2018 important dialogue takes a stock of how close the countries are to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. In 2020, the formal NDC cycle when begins, the countries must submit a new or updated NDC. The global stock also take those evaluations that collectively report the progress and towards the achievement of those Paris Agreement goals. And the world will cross 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold by 2030. Not nearly enough, even if the countries meet the enhanced nationally determined target in future. The carbon budget for most of the countries that in 2000, the China entered the World Trade Organization. It leads to a spike in global emissions. That is approx 25 gigaton carbon dioxide emission in 2000, and then now the condition is so critical. The world will emit 37 gigaton of carbon dioxide in 2030. Even countries made their goals. the world can emit only 18 gigaton of carbon dioxide in 2030. That's the agreement is signed. They have estimated that if you want to remain under 1.5 degree centigrade pathway. But the fact is the world will emit 40.6 gigaton of carbon dioxide in 2030 in business as usual the scenario is generated. That's the target, and we also pledge 50 to 55% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Japan has proposed a stronger NDC target of 46% reduction of greenhouse emission below 2013 level by 2030, but is yet to formally submit. India also assumed into net zero carbon free country by 2070, nearly a 50-year span. For India, they have a 50-year span to become a net zero carbon free countries. The important factor that we project the emissions for 2020 to 2030, the span of 10 years in two scenarios. The first, assuming that the NDC are fully achieved by 2030, or the NDC scenario, as per the report that the global emissions need to reduce by 45% over 2010 level to 2030 to keep the temperature rise by 1.5 degrees centigrade. In 2010, the global CO2 emissions were 33 gigaton. The developed countries have pledged lower emission, that reduction by 2030, than many developing countries. That's the important parameter of a lot of important countries. The unequal world, that scenario is the developed nation enjoy high per capita emissions. The 7 historical polluters, it's 1.18 billion gigatons of carbon emissions. China 1.4 billion. India 1.37 billion. And the rest of the world is 3.73 billion. That's the important parameters. And the comparison of those per capita emission in the 45 countries in 2015 in 2019 and again in 2030, if the NDC are achieved, reveals how the global burden of carbon dioxide reduction is against the developing countries. Unequal world and those human development index that have pledged to reduce their per capita emission by over 50%, while Japan and Australia will reduce them by 30% by 2030. Russia will increase them by 16%. The carbon budget also the important factor for construction on the premises, and that were a linear relationship between the rising global temperature and the level of accumulated atmospheric carbon dioxide. The unfair share that has been generated for the till 1989, the original 7 emitters appropriated 77% of the world carbon space between 1990 and 2019, merely a 30-year span. China, along with the original 7, was behind that 67% of the world emission, and the remaining world, about 66% of the people that emitted only 33%. These are the climate convention. Before, that is 1870 to 1989, 120 years span. That is an important time, and the next important parameters, next important phase is after that phase of 1990 to 2019, 30-year span. Before the climate convention and after the China. Next, the convention is before the climate convention plus the China. This is a merely span of 150 years. How these environmental issues are generated, basically mainly of some important South Asian nation, developed countries and China that are responsible for over 70% of carbon dioxide emission so far. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.